this video we're going to have a look at the eyeball itself. The eyeball, as you probably know, contains the optical apparatus, so everything that, well, at least physically in those terms of lenses and optics and focusing that allows us to see. I've removed the 6 extrinsic muscles that usually control its movements and a lot of its fascial suspensory apparatus. So now we can have a look at a couple of structures that are associated with it intimately. Here is the lacrimal gland. We're going to have a look at the innervation pattern for the lacrimal gland in just a moment. That is actually quite interesting. It does involve the facial nerve, and it involves, yes, it does involve another ganglion, which is called the pterygopalatine ganglion, and then a couple of relays to get these parasympathetic fibers, which are secretomotor fibers, because they help the lacrimal gland secrete tears. Yeah, so that's where they're called secretomotor fibers. Well, how to get those postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers to the eyeball, or actually to the lacrimal gland. So here's the lacrimal gland. Then we have a artery that is named appropriately lacrimal artery, and here is the lacrimal nerve. And technically speaking, the lacrimal nerve is actually a branch of the trigeminal nerve, so actually of the ophthalmic division. However, it also carries parasympathetic fibers that go and innervate the lacrimal gland. Down here we have some other branches. These are zygomatic branches of the facial nerve. Some of these will be responsible for mediating the blink reflex, so the efferent limb of the blink reflex, because these fibers will actually go and innervate the orbicularis oculi muscle, and the parts that are still left over here are called the palpebral parts. You have an orbital part which goes all the way around the outside of the eyeball, and you have a palpebral part which is directly on the eyelids themselves. So this is the palpebral part of the orbicularis oculi. Below that is another nerve. This is called the infraorbital nerve that will exit through a foramen called the infraorbital foramen. And this is purely a sensory nerve. Deep to the tarsal muscles, so the inferior and superior tarsal muscles, we'd actually also find the tarsus itself, which is kind of like a cartilaginous plate. We also have embedded in there, we have some tarsal sebaceous glands. You will secrete a kind of oily lipid secretion which will actually help lubricate the edges of the eyelids and prevent them from sticking together when they close. It also helps form a barrier that lacrimal fluid doesn't cross when produced in normal amounts. When the production of lacrimal fluid from the tear gland, of course, is excessive, as you can imagine, it'll spill over the barrier. The eyelashes here are called cilia, and they will just be on the margins of the upper and lower eyelids. And they also have large sebaceous glands associated with them, and they're called ciliary glands. Then we can call the regions here the junctions of the medial and lateral margins of the eyelids. They are respectively called the medial and lateral palpebral commissure that define the angles of the eyes. You can also find ligaments there, like for instance here the medial palpebral ligament. There's a little fleshy mound in the middle here, which is called the lacrimal caruncle. It's like a little mound of round, moist, modified skin. And around it here, you see this reddish appearing structure. This is the lacrimal lake. It's basically a shallow little reservoir for tears before they then drain into the lacrimal canaliculi, and from the lacrimal canaliculi into the lacrimal sac, and then from the lacrimal sac all the way down through the nasolacrimal duct. Oh, we go down here. That would be a little bit further down here, which then will empty into the inferior meatus of the nose. So if you look at the eyeball from laterally, we can see that it's continuous here with the outer sheath of the optic nerve. Yeah, well, specifically what is continuous with it? It's actually the outer fibrous layer of the eyeball itself. You can also see back here is the common tendinous ring, which is also called the annulus of Zinn, which forms an important attachment sites for many of the extraocular muscles that will actually move the eyeball. So if you think about the construction of the eyeball, it actually has 3 layers if we think about it as a layered structure. It has a fibrous layer, a vascular layer, and an inner layer. Probably best to highlight this on a different type of diagram which has been made by the illustrators from 3D4 Medical. So here you can see the 3 different layers. Okay, so the fibrous layer, or the outer coat, consists of the sclera and the cornea. The sclera and cornea are continuous with each other. The sclera is also described as the white of your eye. And in addition to that, as it is opaque, of course, it will not allow any kind of light to go through. So it'll cover about the posterior 5/6 of your eyeball. The last bit is anteriorly the cornea. And another function, or the, duty of the sclera, so to say, is that it'll provide an attachment site for the extrinsic, so the extraocular, and also the intrinsic muscles of the eye. The anterior part, as I said, is the cornea, and this is actually also innervated. So we can regard the cornea as being the transparent part of the fibrous layer, which covers the anterior 1/6 of the eyeball. Technically, we would say that you can actually see the sclera. It is visible through the bulbar conjunctiva as the white of the eye. If you look at someone's eye, you have, of course, the iris and the pupil, and around there is the white of the eye, sometimes a little bit. You can see some red from the arteries in the white of the eye, but actually it is covered, the sclera is still covered by bulbar conjunctiva, which is transparent there, so you can see right through it. Also, if you look at this, you can see that the cornea has a greater convexity than the sclera, so it seems to protrude a little bit from the eyeball. It seems to stick out just a little bit here. And one of the main differences between the two parts of your fibrous outer coat here is just in terms of how regular or irregular the arrangement of the collagen fibers are that they are made up of. And in addition to that, of course, the degree of hydration of these collagen fibers. The sclera is actually fairly avascular, but the cornea is entirely avascular. So the cornea is only going to get its nourishment from capillary beds that are all the way around it, and from fluids on its external surface, like for instance the lacrimal fluid, or fluids on the internal surface, which is called aqueous humor. Don't worry, we have another slide for that one coming up. The lacrimal fluid on the outside also will help provide oxygen for the cornea. In addition to that, to protect our eyesight, we have to have a very, very sensitive cornea. This is why it's very sensitive to touch, and this is mediated via a branch of the trigeminal nerve, actually from V1, the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. So even a very, very small foreign body, like a dust particle, will elicit blinking and the flow of tears, and sometimes even severe pain. If the corneal surface dries out, that's actually really dangerous because you can get an ulceration. In the worst case, of course, this can lead to blindness. And we can also name the junction between the cornea and the sclera. It's actually called the limbus, which is the angle formed by the intersecting curvatures of the cornea and the sclera. So here's the cornea and there's the sclera. And there's going to be an important little area here, the corneoscleral junction, when we think about the aqueous humor, which nourishes the cornea from behind it, yes, from inside the eyeball. We'll get to that one in just a little bit. The second layer here is the vascular layer. Okay, so you can see here is the vascular layer, and also called the middle coat. And so in here you have something called the choroid, the ciliary body, and the iris. So the choroid is a usually dark reddish brown layer that's between the sclera and the retina. You can see the retina over here on the right. And it has a pretty well pigmented and dense vascular bed. Larger vessels are located pretty close to the sclera, and the finest vessels, like the capillary lamina of the choroid, is called the choriocapillaris, which is a pretty extensive innermost capillary bed that is right next to or adjacent to the avascular light-sensitive layer of the retina, which is supplied by it with oxygen and nutrients. An interesting little factoid is, in life, it is actually so engorged with blood that it has the highest perfusion rate per gram of tissue of all the vascular beds in the body. That's quite impressive, isn't it? It's also the layer that, if you think of flash photography, the red eyes that happen, well, this is the layer, yeah, the choriocapillaris, that is responsible for this red eye reflex. And although the choroid attaches pretty firmly to the pigment layer of the retina, it can fairly easily be stripped away from the sclera. Yeah, so if you have the sclera, the choroid, you can peel it off the sclera fairly easily, but it's firmly attached to the retina. And if we're moving anteriorly, the choroid becomes continuous with the ciliary body, which is basically a ring-like thickening. I'll show you on the next slide. Here is the ciliary body. It's a ring-like thickening that goes all the way around the eyeball, on the anterior aspect, of course. And one of the functions of the ciliary body is to provide an attachment for the lens, because the lens is basically suspended by little fibers called zonular fibers. That's important because by, well, either contracting or relaxing the ciliary body, the muscles of the ciliary body, we can change the shape, and with that also the refractory index of the lens, which is important for accommodation so that we can actually see things in focus. Going back to this one, we can see down here, these are called ciliary processes. Let me just quickly pull up a more elegant picture. Here are the ciliary processes. So these are important because they secrete, this aqueous humor. So for an overview, here's your cornea. This is called the anterior chamber. Back here is the posterior chamber. This is the ciliary body. These are ciliary processes. These are zonular fibers, and here is the lens. And these ciliary processes will secrete this aqueous humor that will fill the anterior and the posterior segment of the eyeball. Also belonging to this middle layer of the eyeball is the iris. And the iris basically not only is responsible for the color of your eye, but it's also like the aperture of a camera. This is a very thin and highly contractile diaphragm with a central aperture, which we will call the pupil. So all the light that falls in through the pupil and reaches the retina, will be determined by the opening of the iris. So when a person is awake, the size of the pupil is going to basically vary continuously as the ambient light around this person changes. And so we have two opposing forces. It's kind of like yin and yang. You have one force that will open up or widen the pupil, called the dilator pupillae, which is innervated sympathetically. And then the contractile parts is called the sphincter pupillae, which is under parasympathetic control. So to constrict the pupil and let less light pass through, we're going to have postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers that go to the sphincter pupillae. These fibers will actually originate from the oculomotor nerve. They will synapse in the ciliary ganglion. Now they're postsynaptic, and then they will actually make the pupil constrict. The postsynaptic sympathetic fiber will have only passed through the ciliary ganglion. These are sympathetics. They actually have synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. Okay, so although the fibers will travel through the ciliary ganglion, they will actually not have synapse there if these are sympathetic fibers. The sympathetic fibers will have synapse, as I just said, in the superior cervical ganglion. Let me see if I can show you a picture. Here's a diagram for everybody who already knows the autonomic nervous system. This should look familiar. If you don't, then we're definitely going to have to revisit that, because this is a complicated thing that you do really need to understand. So in terms of the dilator pupillae, to get the sympathetic fibers there, the route that would be chosen for a presynaptic sympathetic fiber would originate from the intramediolateral cell column, which is in the lateral horn, and it would go, this is like for instance from T1, okay, would go out of the ventral rootlets via the ventral root through the mixed spinal nerve through a white ramus communicans, and then the choice would be to ascend in the sympathetic chain, because we need to get this presynaptic fiber all the way up. We can't find a presynaptic fiber above T1 or below L2 or L3. So here the route is chosen to ascend, okay? And here the synapse happens in the superior cervical ganglion, and then you have the postsynaptic sympathetic fiber traveling via a cephalic arterial ramus along the carotid plexus of nerves. It's a periarterial plexus because it's a plexus of nerves around arteries, and then it'll actually go via a cephalic arterial ramus, travel all the way to the dilator pupillae. Now they've actually left out the little ciliary ganglion here because for the sympathetics it's not relevant. It's not a relay station, it just passes right through there. Okay, that is the course of the sympathetic fibers. So let's trace the course of parasympathetic fibers to the sphincter pupillae. We will have light coming in here and going all the way through the cornea and the lens and the anterior posterior chamber of the eyeball, hitting the retina. There the signal gets transmitted to the brain. We have a relay at the pretectal nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, And then we actually have the oculomotor nerve. It's going to be a parasympathetic fiber that's presynaptic, goes to the ciliary ganglion, synapses here, and then the postsynaptic parasympathetic fiber will lead to a constriction or contraction of the sphincter pupillae.